Welcome to the Designing Hollywood podcast in association with the John Campea Show. I am your host, Robert Meyer Burnett. Today's episode is sponsored by the Costumes Rental Corporation. Today's guest is a cinematographer who took home the Oscar for Best Cinematography for Dune and joined the small elite group of cinematographers to be awarded the trifecta of an Oscar, a BAFTA, and an ASC award for the same work in the same year. He was also nominated for each of the 3 awards for Lion, for which he won the ASC award and earned an additional ASC nomination for his work on the television series The Mandalorian. As an aside, he should have been nominated for an Oscar for The Batman, but that's just me. The movies he's worked on, such as Dune and The Batman, have been massive crowd pleasers. The cinematographer notes that the heart of his photography is rooted in truth, an integrity and honesty of the image, no matter how fantastical the story might be. But more than just the public reaction to his skills is what he's doing behind the scenes. He's well known in the industry as someone who pushes the envelope and rides the edge of technological advancement. And we're going to talk to him right now. And this is for Designing Hollywood. We're breaking out, and we're not just talking to costume designers this year, but we're going to start looking at the broader industry at large. And I am so honored and privileged to be speaking with Greig Fraser, the cinematographer of the upcoming, my most eagerly awaited film of 2024, Dune Part 2. Greig, thank you so much. It's great to have you here on the podcast. Thanks for joining us for Designing Hollywood.
I appreciate that really good introduction. I'm going to send that to my mum. I think she'll appreciate hearing about it.
Well, you know, I'm really fascinated by your career. I was telling you when we started that since you've been a cinematographer, you've really spanned the transition of going from traditional film into digital, and you've been pioneering. You're at the cutting edge of the industry and using digital cameras, and we've seen so many interesting advancements over the last 10 years. But before we get to that, how did you get into cinematography?
It was a bit of a long-winded and long path in because I didn't really ever know that there was a thing called a cinematographer. Nothing in my sphere of learning when I was a teenager or even a young adult really showed me that there was a thing called a cinematographer. Like, I knew what a photographer does because that's obvious. We all saw them at the weddings, and we all saw them doing fashion shoots. And I knew what a director does because, we all knew Steven Spielberg, and we all knew the directors that kind of were directing some of the biggest movies. But I never really understood what a cinematographer did. I didn't know that the job existed. I knew what a cameraman did as well, like say on the news or but I didn't know that there was someone in charge of the aesthetic creatively for a movie, visually, I should say. So it wasn't until I studied photography that I focused myself on photography because I wanted to be an I mean, it sounds a little bit silly, but like an artist as opposed to a technician. But at the same time, there's 2 parts of my brain that's like, there's a bit of tech, there's a bit of art, there's a bit of kind of an amalgam of those two roles. And, I found photography to be a little bit of a lonely job. It was a singular job where, yes, you interacted with people for your work, but you didn't really team up with people. And it wasn't until I joined a photography/film studio in Melbourne called Exit Films that I saw the filmmakers make films and commercials and music videos and, TV station idents and stuff, that I just went, wow, this is cool. This is an amalgam of minds, an amalgam of skills, all making something much better than it could have been had one person been involved in, designing the sets or lighting it or directing the actors or designing the costumes. All those things were in the wheelhouse of a photographer when I was coming up, but now I saw it where experts were doing those things.
Right.
So I found it to be really interesting, and I started to veer out of photography towards cinematography.
Well, yeah, and you started working on shorts. You did music videos. I mean, I love that you worked on a How to Destroy Angels video. Trent Reznor and his wife. I'm a big fan of that sort of side project they did. And you did videos with Bob Dylan. You know,
Yep.
I find that just absolutely fascinating. Now, when you started shooting, we started to talk about this, but it was really that transition point where video and was sort of taking over digital capture was taking over from film itself. But coming from a photography background, did you begin that transition working with DSLRs or starting to work digitally, or did you work with film mostly when you were in learning how to be a photographer?
It was only film. Yeah. I mean, I recall the first digital camera that I used on a film project that I was shooting, and I kind of stumbled upon the fact that I could use this digital stills camera as a faux light meter, as a lighting check or as a reference check. The stills cameras at that point weren't very good for motion. They were okay for stills, but they weren't good for motion. So it wasn't really a viable thing to use. But then, if you look at the evolution of digital, the 5D came out, and suddenly there was a bigger sensor on the 5D, and we were getting motion on the 5D. I remember I was doing all the testing for Killing Them Softly, which was at that point Kogan's Trade is what it was called. And Andrew and I were shooting these tests on the 5D and loving the way the 5D looked, for that movie, but it wasn't high res enough. I think it was HD or barely HD or something.
And the color space too.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't developed enough to do something good. But at that point, in the periphery, a lot of other digital cameras were coming up that were, the Alexa and the Red One, and the Sony had released a F900, I think, or the Genesis. So there was a whole series of cameras that were coming up through, and there was a point where, I think my first film on digital was 0 Dark 30, and that was the perfect film for that camera because we needed to be run and gun, it needed to be high speed. We didn't want to be cutting film stock around the Middle East and India. Like, it needed to be a bit more compact, and that kind of proved it. So it's been great. That transition between film and digital has been wonderful. I mean, for me, who likes to mix it up every time I do a job, like to change an element or to learn something new or learn a new format or learn a new ratio or learn a new set of lenses, having digital come up and through has been a bit of a godsend because, I've enjoyed trying to maximize the quality of every single one of the formats that I've shot on and try to shoot it the best way possible, all the way from, the highest end Alexa or Sony or Red right through to, say, the iPhone, just trying to maximize the not the quality in terms of res or the quality in terms of kind of the lighting, just to maximize its potential.
Sure. Well, it's in your works. I love watching sort of the evolution of your work. But one of the things I wanted to touch on, I had read an article, the 5 movies that made you want to make movies. And, and
what were they? Tell me again, because I forgot.
Well, there was Ratcatcher, Tarkovsky's The Mirror, and there was Jane Campion's The Piano was one of them. And I love the fact that you then made Bright Star with her. What was it like? I mean, obviously a lot of fans watch this show, people that love genre cinema and things like that. But as somebody who admired an artist, and then you actually got to work with Jane Campion, what was that like for you?
I mean, there was the initial element of, oh my God, I'm working with Jane Campion. That's the of course, the initial thing. But thankfully, we had done a short film before that. We had done a short film called The Water Diary, and it was part of a bigger festival piece. But we did this film, and I recall I got the call to go in and do the meeting with Jane. And like most young, keen, eager cinematographers, I spent weeks developing a whole series of references and images, motion, and I kind of went in there and went, right, so this is blah, 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 blah. I started becoming really sort of front foot and she hated all of my references. And
Oh no.
and I remember walking out going, "Oh, I've just lost the job." And I realized that actually, again, this was a really big learning curve for me about how to to size up your audience before you even open your mouth. Because Jane operates differently to, say, some of the directors that I'd worked with previously. Like, Jane's a lot more softly spoken. Her ideas are more softly given, if that makes sense.
Yes, sure.
They're not less firm, and they're not less defined. I mean, she is defined as heck, but the way she exhibits those ideas and puts forward her energy on set or interacting with people was a lot different to, say, the people who I'd worked with prior.
Right.
So for me, that was a great learning curve, just to shut the hell up sometimes and to listen. And I still carry that through this day. I still mess up sometimes. I still open my mouth sometimes and go, "Greg, shut up. Just listen." Like, just listen. Because, sometimes, like, there's ideas here and crazy, like, I want to do this and try that and blah, blah, blah. Like sometimes my brain becomes my worst enemy. Or my mouth is my worst enemy, not necessarily my brain, just the translation. So for that, I really learned a big lesson, and about just shutting up, listening, and then going from there. So more often than not, in these first meetings with directors, they're very one-sided. I don't say very much. It's not because I don't have ideas. It's
Right. Well, that was but at least it worked out, because you ended up doing the short and you did a feature with Jane.
Yeah, and it was beautiful. I mean, I think life's a series of learning experiences, isn't it? Like, where if you stop learning, which is why I'm, going back to the technology discussion. That's why I'm enjoying pushing the technology.
Yeah.
But like, on Bright Star, it was such a great experience to obviously work with Jane and to work within Jane's methodologies, which I still carry. But also we studied Keats, we studied poetry, we studied words, and I hadn't done that as a kid or as a teenager. Like, that wasn't in my wheelhouse. Like, I was in heavy metal bands and long hair and, and moshing at the local pub. I wasn't into reading Keats and some of the romantic writers.
Sure.
So for me, it forced me into studying this poetry, and from that, it created images. It created images that kind of I could then translate. I could use the skill that I developed up to that point to translate those emotions or feelings that I was having, reading those combinations of words, to try and then, translate that into a visual. And it doesn't translate directly. You can't say, someone sitting under a tree writing about the unrequited love, but how do you then translate that color-wise, daytime-wise, time of day-wise, lens-wise, film stock-wise, because that was film. Like, how does that all translate? So I had a great time translating something that was intangible into something that had to become tangible.
Well, I'm a huge Catherine Bigelow fan. I remember seeing she co-directed her first feature, which was called The Loveless, with Willem Dafoe, and it was a biker movie. And then she came out of art school. She was a painter, and in the 80s she directed a vampire movie. She directed Near Dark, which visually is, I mean, all of her films are striking visually, but I remember watching Near Dark and was just absolutely knocked out by it. There's a sequence in it where there's a dawn gunfight where the vampires are holed up in a motel, and the shafts of light that are coming through the bullet holes are burning them, and they're trying to they're trying to shoot at the cops. And I find it interesting that you've worked with both Jane Campion and Catherine Bigelow, both of which, won Academy Awards for directing. And Zero Dark 30 was, again, just a knockout film. I mean, I wish that Catherine Bigelow had made, or I hope she made more movies, but I just coming off making The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30, I was, again, I've loved all of her movies, but I was just knocked out by Zero Dark 30, and it was such a different approach. I mean, her approach is, I don't know what you'd call it, more meaty, more powerhouse, more in your face than say Jane Campion's. It's a like totally different approach. But
Very
like you said, Zero Dark 30 really makes use of digital and how you were able to run and gun. And I'm just curious, what was it like working with Catherine Bigelow, and how did you, because she came again out of a film background and then moving into digital, what was it like, the collaboration between the two of you on that film?
Well, you know, obviously when I choose to push the boundaries, I need the full backing of the director. You know, like, because I don't want to be standing out there on an island by myself when something goes wrong. Going, well, you suggested, Greg, that we do this. Like, it's more of like we own it together. We own the successes and failures together. And that was where I was. Catherine and I tested digital because we knew that we had this raid at the end of the movie, which took place in pitch blackness.
Right.
And so our perfect scenario in 2012, and we made it, was to shoot in real moonlight, and that was the ideal. And we even drove out to Palmdale, outside of LA, where we'd lose the city lights so that we had dead darkness, and we tested it in the hope that perhaps maybe it could shoot in moonlight. Now it couldn't, but it came super close. Like, it was the closest thing that we'd seen. We tested film, we tested 16 mil, like we tested all those things. That Hurt Locker was shot on 16 mil, so we tested those just for reference. But it ended up being that the Alexa at that point was the most sensitive camera to low light, and so we decided to go that route. And frankly, I think it was the best route for it. You know, I've had a few people subsequently say they thought it would be better on film, and I've said to them, quite frankly, like, visually maybe, but that's an aesthetic choice that they would choose. But I said, practically, there is no way that film would have been better on film. You know, like, this is where Catherine, you know, shines. Her skill level at rolling with the punches is incredible. Like, she'll prepare, and we'll build sets, and we'll do all those things that you do as filmmakers, but she'll respond instinctively on the day to things that occur. And the ability as a film crew for us to pivot was critically important. We needed to be able to, like, if she chose to change a day scene to a night scene simply because, well, the previous day scene went over and now we're into a night time and we have to shoot a quick scene at nighttime, like, I as a cinematographer have to pivot. I have to be ready with lights. I have to be ready with the right film stock.
Right.
And if we're traveling through India in the Middle East and I've suddenly got a truck full of every film stock imaginable because I don't know what's coming up. It wasn't that crazy. It wasn't that cowboy. Like, but there were times where we absolutely needed to pivot, and that's Catherine's superpower. She can pivot, and she does, and she uses her instinct incredibly well to make decisions that might not be the most favorable from a production standpoint, but are the best for the movie. So
right.
we have to support that, and we should, if we have to support her drive to do that.
Well, one of the things about your career that I found interesting, those 5 films that you were, I'm drawing a blank on what the other 2 were, but I'm a huge Tarkovsky fan. And when you said The Mirror, I'm like, oh, I like this guy, just reading about you. But you have found your way into a lot of fantasy films, Snow White and the Huntsman. You started working with Matt Reeves on Let Me In. And anybody who watches my YouTube channel knows that I'm always talking about the quality of verisimilitude. And the first time I ever really heard that word was watching the behind the scenes on Superman the movie, watching Richard Donner talk about verisimilitude. Like, how do you make an audience believe a man can fly? How do you make an audience believe that a vampire exists? Or how do you make an audience believe that there's giant sandworms on Arrakis? And one of the things that I've always loved about your work is a lot of people will use lots of colored gels and make things very stylized, and and heightened, but you bring a quality of, I don't know how to describe it, but a quality of real, that verisimilitude that makes you believe in the, I mean, sure, Snow White and the Huntsman's very stylized, but when you get to Dune and the Batman, there is such a quality of the real, I guess, in what you're doing that I think is very hard to achieve. And I was curious from a philosophical standpoint, how do you begin approaching a color palette? I mean, are you looking to achieve that quality of the real? Are you looking, because to me, the greatest example in fantasy filmmaking of that quality of real is in fact Dune. I sat in the theater. I saw Dune for the first time on the Warner lot in the Steve Ross Theater, just because it's one of the greatest movie theaters in the world, and I was blown away. I mean, I'm like, I'd never seen anything. You must have gone to Arrakis and actually shot on that planet, because it looked like you were there. And how do you do that? Like, where does one begin? Do you and Denis Villeneuve just sit in a room going, okay, Greg, you got to make this look real, buddy? And then what do you do?
Well, I mean, listen, it's a great question. It's a multi-pronged answer, because obviously there's Arrakis, and obviously there's
Caladan,
Yavin on Star Wars, and obviously there's so just going back a few steps before we get to Arrakis. Like, I feel, and perhaps this is short-sighted, and maybe I won't feel this in 2 years or 1 year or the next movie, but that audiences, when they pay their $12.50, they want to believe what they're seeing. Like,
yes.
It's that suspension of disbelief. Like, we don't go into a film and go, right, this is obviously bullshit, and I don't believe that man is in love with that woman, and because I know that they've got relationships outside the film. Like, nobody does that. Nobody looks at George Clooney in a film and doesn't believe he's not in love with, the female actress, or he's not an astronaut. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Sure.
No one. We all know George Clooney's not an astronaut. Sandra Bullock's not an astronaut. We've never been to space, and so why the heck in Gravity do we ever believe that they are actually in space?
Right.
And why can she? You know what I mean? Like,
that's the great magic trick of the movies.
It's exactly right. It's almost ridiculous. It's almost ridiculous that we as mature adults are gullible enough to walk into a film, pay the money, and be lied to like that. Like, if you break it down, like, it's kind of silly, but it's magical. That's exactly right. So I would hope that to create worlds that actually you play off the fact that people are that gullible. I say that in a positive way again.
Right.
It
Sure.
sounds ridiculously like I'm trying to manipulate, but you play off the fact that people are that willing to buy into it, and you try not to give them a reason to not believe it. Does that make sense?
Yes, 100%.
You want to kind of not pull them out of it. I feel like my job and my colleagues' jobs is to act as the conscious version of the audience's subconscious. And Denis and I would often refer to our mums as our guiding light. Like, my mother has no idea about filmmaking, nor does his mother. But we're like, well, would our mums believe that? Like, sure, our mums know that you can't space travel, right? And my mum knows there's no big sandworm, but visually, would she be questioning this shot? Like, and I don't know. It's a bit of a sort of a simple metric, but
I think mothers are the perfect audience, because if you make them believe that, because like you said, they don't know. I'll tell you a quick funny story to apply to that. My mom took me to see Raiders of the Lost Ark when I was a kid, and we were driving home, and she wasn't saying anything. And I said to my mom, Mom, well, what did you think of the movie? And she said, that could never happen. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, that scene where he's hanging off the back of the car with the truck with the bullwhip, and the gravel and the dirt was going into his face? He could never hang on. And I was like, wait, well, what about the power of God coming out of the Ark of the Covenant and vanquishing the Nazis? And my mom's like, oh, that's 10 Commandments. Charlton Heston, part of the Red Sea. It could happen. But the dirt in the face, that could never happen. And that, like you just said, I'm like, that's if you can make moms believe, because they will see things and they will come up with stuff that you can't, and you're saying the exact same thing, because the litmus test of mothers might be the greatest lesson. The way you put it, that's it. So how
I think it's guilelessness or innocence that we kind of try and channel ourselves through. Like where, my children, for example, who are sort of around the age of 10, don't know enough about filmmaking to understand anything. So there are certain films they watch that I ask for their opinion on. Like I won't mention the movies, but there are some films that I feel like maybe don't look the best, and some films that do look good. And I try and ask them about how they feel about those films and what they say. And there was one film in particular that I thought was not good, and I will not mention it. But we got to the end of it, or they got to the end of it, and I said, "How do you feel that looked? How do you feel about that film?" Yeah, it's okay. How do you feel it looked? It's a bit plastic. I was like,
wow.
Plastic how? As in like what, the sets or the people or the costumes, or? And I went, no, not plastic. It's just, how plastic is this brittle, like, anyway, the words they used were very childlike. They weren't
sure, but
studied words. And I was like, well, basically I got to the bottom of the fact that everything they saw looked false and looked thin, and didn't, like, the VFX didn't integrate properly, and the
and they can tell, they can see it. They might not have the words, but they can see it.
100%. Yeah.
Well, to me, it's sort of an interesting counterpoint. Like, I mean, I know we can get to Dune, but there's a shot in Dune, and it's on Caladan, and it's when the Duke and Paul are walking through those, I guess they're tombs. It's like a graveyard. It's outside, and it's just it's not a difficult shot. It's not a showy shot, but the way you framed it, and watching them just walk down, and the way that the production design had come up with these, it was otherworldly, but you absolutely believe that you're standing that place is real, that whatever that is on Caladan, where the tombs of the people that came before the Atreides family graveyard, there was something just about that single shot, the way you framed it, and seeing the tombs like descend into the background, and you're there. Like there's something about that. It looks, even the fact that the tombs were not perfectly aligned, that they were kind of, like they'd been there and the ground had settled for hundreds of years. Yeah. And just watching that shot, and you're like, because you had talked about, I'd read that you spoke about the compositions you wanted to keep fairly simple, and yet that, to me, that shot, it's a simple shot. It's maybe it's a lock off, and you're looking at these two guys, a father and son, just walking through the history of their whole lineage, and you believe, and it was the composition, the lighting, the way, and it was not. It doesn't have to be showy, and I'm curious, when you're developing these ideas with a director, are there tricks you're going to use? Do you understand color palettes in terms of the difference between like Snow White and the Huntsman and Dune? In terms of the color palettes that you're going to use, filters that you want to use, the kinds of lights you're going to use or employ, is this something that you can come up with in your mind? Or is this something that you have to discover when you get onto a location? Or
I mean, I think a location helps guide, for example. With Caladan, we knew what the color palette was. Clearly, it was greens and blues because of where it was. Greens, blues, and grays. But it had to be very different to Arrakis. That was the kind of the whole driving factor. It's clearly written that it's totally
sure,
different, like it's by the water and stuff like that. So, it had to be different. But visually, there was a grounding in reality. I say our reality, like us as humans, we only know one reality. Like,
yes.
We only know this reality. And it's important, I think, that we as an audience relate to something. We have to. I think otherwise it becomes like, oh, well, that's a weird designed world, and that doesn't I can't picture how that would be to be that. Like,
right.
Every good sci-fi has a grounding in Earth-based reality.
Yes.
I mean, you look at something like Interstellar. I mean, obviously they had to shoot those other planets on Earth. They couldn't go to other planets, but every planet they've got has a reality check. You know, they're either in the water with a big wave, or they're on an ice planet with
Yeah.
rocks. It's stuff that we know, stuff that we've seen, and maybe some of us have been there. So I think for Caladan, it was about making sure that we had the right basis. And visually, it does happen that you in prep you develop what you want it to look like, and then you hopefully find the locations to suit. But if those locations don't come up, then you've got to then maybe adjust the brief a little bit. But when I reference, I mean, for example, when I reference a film, I tend to think about it like you're going into a room, a locked room, and before you go into that room, you can collect any references that you want visually in your head. You can watch any films, you can take anything into that room, from a film that you want to a film that you don't want. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's important, I think, to isolate what it is you don't want as much as it is about what you do want. So when you go into that room, which is the film in your brain, I tend to close the door so that I can't put anything else into that room. And the times that I have opened the door, i.e. seen a film, watched a movie in the middle of a film, it's backfired, because it meant that my closed door world building gets infected with another film. And
Wow. Okay.
It's happened a few times, enough times for me to say I don't watch films when I'm making other films or grading other films. I can't. For me, I can't. I've got to be careful that I don't infect a film that way. Maybe I'm getting better at it, that I can do that, to work on multiple things at the same time. But yeah.
Well, there's just things, I remember watching Rogue One, and at the beginning of Rogue One, I guess you were shooting in Iceland. And it's when they land, when Ben Mendelsohn lands to go recruit Mads Mikkelsen to, you got to come help us finish the Death Star. And there's the great landscape shot, which they comp in an Imperial shuttle when Mendelsohn lands. But what I loved about that opening of Rogue One is that we've seen Star Wars movies, we've seen Star Wars environments, and I think one of the things about Star Wars that always made it work is that they went to Tunisia, or they went to Yuma, Arizona, or they went to the Redwoods up in Northern California to shoot Endor, and going and establishing Rogue One with a opening in an environment. We weren't on the glaciers of Norway, but you were in Iceland, and you had it looked different. It was a real environment, like you said, an earthbound environment, and you immediately planted your flag, because Rogue One, we'd never seen the tropical waters in Star Wars before. And you made such great use of those real world locations. And I think I love Rogue One. People love Rogue One because I think it has that Star Wars feel. Was that something that you were talking to with the director at the beginning? Like, you wanted to, okay, where can we go for different real world environments to shoot this movie?
100,000% actually, because when Gareth and I both studied Star Wars since we were kids, it's in our blood. Definitely episodes 4, 5, and 6, and what we discovered and what we studied when we were prepping the movie, maybe it was a realization that we had that everybody knows, but to us it was like, well, these environments are super simple. Like, the environments that occur in Star Wars, particularly episodes 4, 5, and 6, are very simple. Like, you look at the desert planet, boom.
Right.
You look at Hoth, snow, boom. You look at the redwoods. It's very simple visually. If you blur your eyes, your memory eyes, and think about what they look like, the redwoods, vertical, they're like Hoth, like, it's very, very, very basic and very simple kind of visual language. And it was really interesting that the process of finding that location for the opening of Rogue, we went in a bit of a circle, because we knew, okay, so the story was this guy becomes a farmer, right? He used to work for the Empire. He's left. He's had a kid. Had a family, and he's become a really simple farmer. And so then you ask yourself, well, where in the Star Wars universe do you farm? Like, what does that look like? Does it look like wheat fields? Well, maybe, but is that too earthly? Like, let's use Interstellar again as a reference.
Yeah.
Those wheat fields were fantastic, but would that work as a Star Wars environment? I would fear that maybe it wouldn't work because it's too earthbound. But if you become a farmer, like what do you farm then? Like, do you farm? Are you in like a biosphere with like hydroponic stuff, or is that too futuristic? Like, again, I think that might be too futuristic for Star Wars. So if you take all those questions and go, well, where does a farmer farm in Star Wars? Well, we know that there's moisture evaporators on Tatooine,
Right.
We know that Luke's uncle's a farmer. For what? Moisture? Maybe? I don't know what is farming, actually. Maybe I'm not geeky enough to know. But he's a farmer, but he's farming on Tatooine. Like, what's he farming? And so we decided that we were going to look for grass fields and then put some moisture evaporators around. And we found some great references of some great fields in China, but we weren't shooting in China. And then we went to Iceland to find some grass fields, because you can't just find grass fields. Like, again, like, there's grass fields aplenty everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But they all look like grass fields.
Yeah.
And in the UK, grass fields look like sheep should be there, or there should be grazing livestock.
Right.
And so we went to Iceland to find a grass field, and we found a few good ones. But then we were driving back to the road one day, and we found this patch, which is common in Iceland, because there's black sand that occurs on the beaches there.
Right.
Which is another beautiful thing. It's like sand that we know, but it's black,
which is amazing.
I.e. the piano. But what they've done in Iceland is that they've planted this weed in the black sand in stretches. They fly planes over next to the road, and they drop this seed on the black sand, and you get this weed growing up. And the benefit of that is that it stops all the sand from blowing from the sand onto the roads, protecting the car, protecting the roads. But it's purely weed. It's a weed. You can't eat it. You can't do anything. It's a weed that can grow in this sand. But it's almost like parallel. The way it's farmed is really interesting. And so we drove past this and went, oh, maybe this is what he's farming. And he was, and I thought it was really successful. I was really happy with the way that turned out. Again, you put a moisture evaporator on that, and you end up with a green shoot of whatever that plant was,
right,
next to black sand with a moisture evaporator in Star Wars.
Well, right? I mean, that's the thing that I'm obsessed with for any movie. Like, it's all, like you said, it's all make-believe. Everything is designed, everything in the proscenium of a frame. None of it's real. It's put there by the film crew, and one wrong costume, or one wrong, if there's too many chairs around a table, or too many, or not enough, low budget movies, or if you're only shooting on a 50 the whole time. I mean, you can do that if you're Luca, like on Tell Me Your Name, he used one lens to shoot the whole movie.
Yeah.
But anything can betray the reality of a movie at one wrong, but it's the collection of those choices. And I have to say that was what struck me, that location that you found. And that's a great, I didn't know that story. That's an amazing story. So you still found something real world that's otherworldly, the black sand, Iceland, and then those happy accidents. Now, when you find that location, then you could ruin it you could overlight it, you could overgel it. How do you retain the reality then of that location through your camera work, so you don't push it too far in one direction or another, and you are able to retain? Because I think in the Creator, you did that the whole movie. The whole movie was all of these unbelievable real locations that just fed into the future and made you believe, but you retained the reality of it, and you retain the, like, how do you not overlight something like that? How do you know when you've gone far enough or not? You have to push it a little further. Like, what is it you do to retain the reality? I
mean, I think that to be simple, I mean, you don't do anything. you point a camera at the right
Right,
thing,
right.
I mean, it sounds. I mean, I should really try and make it a bit more complicated so that producers are listening and justify my fee.
Well, no, because
Um,
knowing when to keep it simple is a skill too.
I mean, you've got to work on the instinct, don't you? You've got to work on the instinct of when does it start to jar? When does it start to become too garish? When does it start to become forced? Like at what point do you does it get to that point? And every step along the way, every decision that you make potentially has the ability to make stuff go over that line of it becoming garish and becoming overwrought and over designed and too arched. So, personally, I prefer to do less,
Mm.
and it has nothing to do with laziness. It has to do with an aesthetic kind of choice where I would much prefer to see the right location and the right coverage underdone than overdone. So that's just a personal preference thing there.
Well, I mean, for me, as a fan of that kind of cinema, your work speaks for itself, because in a way, I felt that way about Dune. I'm like, I love this because it could have been way more stylized, but it's not underdone because so much work was done there's so much the effects work. It's all seamless. It's probably the most seamless film, science fiction film ever made in terms of jumping between visual effects. I mean, you can't tell where you're using a real ornithopter, a full-size ornithopter, and then there's a model. I mean, there's no delineation at all. It's jaw-dropping. I've sat and watched Dune. I've watched Dune silent. I've turned off the sound and just watched the images so it doesn't get in the way, and just to study the coverage jumping between those things. And it's a marvel of verisimilitude. But then again, you teamed up with Matt Reeves again, and you did the Batman, which I also thought was a marvel of going from, like, you could be out in a graveyard watching Bruce Wayne on a motorcycle from a distance, and you're outside shooting, and then be in a nightclub looking for the Penguin, and it's the most stylized thing in the world, where you're going full on Blade Runner, watching Batman wreck fools, and it's completely stylized, and yet it still feels of a piece. It's not like you believe that the exterior of Gotham City that you created also you can jump into the stylization of that nightclub, and that works as well. So how do you like, when you're shooting exteriors in something like the Batman, and then you want to go into a club which is obviously completely lit, how do you retain that quality of real going between the two?
Well, I think it's a series of decisions technically. Obviously, the way that we shot it and filmed it out through film, I think, is helpful to help bridge the divide between those things. But I also think that there is certain choices that we made. Like, again, going back to the way that I reference, I spent months referencing that film because, you read the film and it's a dark film. Like, it's a dark film set in a dark place. Gotham is not lit super well. The Batman hides in the shadows. Not hides, sorry. He works in the shadows. He doesn't hide. He works in the shadows. So it's important to keep him dark, and also to understand that the Batman overlit can look a little bit unconvincing,
which we've seen before.
We have, and again, going back to that whole suspension of disbelief thing, like we want to believe that there's a guy dressed up in a leather suit running around with a cape, bashing people up. Like, we want to believe it. I want to believe it. It's that in a child, but suddenly you put too much light on the guy, and you start to go, wow, is this guy mentally there? Like, Because if you saw somebody dressed like that in the CVS at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you would start to question sanity and your own sanity. I would. Matt and I talked a lot about this, going, we love the way the Batman looks, as in the costume and the aura, which is why we did the movie, frankly, because it's an amazing silhouette. You think back about you think about that character. And he's a great example of design, of costume, character, backstory. Like, he's a great character. It's a historical great character that we all know. And going from Bruce Wayne to the Batman with the backstory where he has, it's a great character to kind of maximize. So Matt and I worked for months, years actually, to be frank, because I think I was working with Matt really early on to help visualize that film. And we figured out a way to try and make it look like, I did a document called Light But Dark, which I sent to him. And I said, here is a series of light images, but they're dark. And the way to do that is to always have a bright light source in shot, always have them silhouetted and dark, like it'd be like this back behind me would be lit, whereas I'd be down and I'd have a little bit of light just in the eye, to create that kind of aura of everything operating in the shadows. Everything in Gotham needed to be dark, but dank, dark in aura, not just lighting. So, part of that was we used the color of real street lights. Very rarely did we ever use film lights as such. We obviously used film lights because we're making a movie, but very rarely would we ever use film lights for, to light filmically. It was all very urban. It was very urban lighting. It was urban concepts. If we were outside, we were outside in the cloud. We were not in the sun. And
right.
I think there's a couple of scenes we shot. We fought the sun, I think, out at the Mayor's Memorial, outside the Mayor's Memorial, which is Bruce pulls up to the Mayor's Memorial, walks up the stairs, sees the Penguin and that group at the top of the stairs. And, we had to shoot that over the course of 3 or 4 days, and we had to dodge the sun. So it became a real exercise of making sure that nothing was shot in the sun, because the sun was not appropriate for Gotham. Gotham was rainy, dark, bleak, that was a very deliberate choice to make.
Oh, it was great. And what I loved about it too is that obviously you have the Tim Burton, Joel Schumacher era of Batman, which is totally stylized and there's not a lot of verisimilitude. Then the Christopher Nolan era of Batman, which was more urban and really realistic. He sort of removed all the gothic out of, because we're shooting in Chicago, and it was, whereas I thought what you did with Matt Reeves was kind of a combination of the two in a way. It was not Anton Furst totally weird designed buildings, but like you said, it was Gotham as a dank, dark place. Like everything was wet, and it had a very, and it was a great feel. I thought it was it was new. It was something new. It was the same way that Batman has been reinvented. You brought something new to it that we hadn't seen before, and I loved it. I mean, I love the way that the Batman looked, and like those scenes when you're in the unfinished building, looking out with the sun and all that stuff. It just had a great feel to it. Now, obviously, I would imagine you're doing Batman 2. And when you're doing,
I mean, who knows? In the film business, to be honest with you, mate, I've become really kind of zen about the way the film business works. Like with the last few years that we've all experienced with strikes and COVID, and at this point in time, I don't know what I'm doing. Frankly, I don't know where I am. I mean, I know where I am, of course, but like what I'm doing is I'm doing whatever it is I'm doing. But dearly, I would love to do another Batman, of course, because I love Matt. I love that film.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great too. But like, one of the things I've not understood about the film business, and I guess Dune is a perfect example for me because as a fan of the novels, the six Frank Herbert novels, when they were going to do Dune and break it up into two movies or talk about, I mean, obviously I understand the expense. People are afraid of their jobs. But after like Lord of the Rings proved that you could embark on, if you're going to adapt the books, there's the three books there, and of course they shot them, but then they had to do a lot of pickups. I mean, they're quote unquote, they weren't reshoots, they were pickups. They lasted 60 days for each film. But I'm like, for Dune, it was like, why don't you're in the same places. Why don't you just amortize the cost and shoot the whole movie, shoot both films and break it up? I mean, I get that. And I had heard that originally the plan was to do three movies. They were going to do Dune Prophet, and Dune Messiah. That was what I had heard. This was back when you guys first started. Obviously, you got to do Dune 2. Now everyone's talking about you might be doing Dune Messiah, which makes sense because I love when people say, well, Paul Atreides is a white savior. And I'm like, you guys really haven't read Dune Messiah because it's not like that. But when you were doing Dune 2, obviously, was everything going to stay the same? I mean, we're going to see different environments. You're going to go to different planets. Because in Dune 1, you see Caladan, Arrakis, and Giedi Prime.
Yep.
But in Dune 2, you're going to go see the lair of the Padishah Emperor, so you're going to go to other planets. I still don't know yet what we're going to see. I can't wait. But were there things that when you moved into Dune 2 that you wanted to do differently? Like now that you were going to do different environments and things like that? Or were you going to keep the same approach that you had for the first film?
It's a good question about how much this is part two of the same film versus its own standalone film.
You're right.
It is a standalone film. People will not watch both at the same time for the most part. Maybe some will. Some diehard fans will. They'll watch it and then go to the cinema, and I think that's a great idea. Because I have watched it like that as well. I watched the first one and then I went to a screening and I was like, this is a great, you have a break, like the break is your intermission, driving to the cinema, and then you go and see the film. So I think that's a brilliant way to watch the film. So the film had to relate, of course. It's not a totally different movie. It's the same characters with some extra characters. But it's more, it's kind of more, it's more fleshing out that story. It's
Sure.
more fleshing out those relationships. And so, part one was more of a kind of introduction to the characters and definitely introduction to Chani, but it's more of, it's fleshing out more Chani, more Paul, more Emperor. I mean, again, I can't talk specifically until the film's out, but you've seen the trailer.
Of course.
We know that there is relationships there with the Emperor, and there's relationships with Irulan, and there's that whole introduction of new characters, which was a really exciting aspect for us to introduce these new characters and these new locations. And yeah, I'm with you. Obviously, it would have been sort of probably more cost effective to shoot in the desert once as opposed to go back.
Right.
Twice.
I mean, it doesn't. That's why it doesn't. I mean, you got Denis Villeneuve. The man has made Dune, Blade Runner 2049, and Arrival are three of the greatest science fiction films, ever made. And I mean, I know you're not a sound designer, but I would say that Blade Runner 2049 and Dune have the greatest sound design ever done for a film ever. I mean, they're just
wait till you see Dune 2.
Well, there's so much more. I mean, war.
Wait. Just, and I'm not a connoisseur of sounds by any stretch of the imagination. Like I love sound, of course, but I'm not a connoisseur. But I walked out of there just going, "Oh, my mind was blown."
I don't even know how they, the opening drums, the percussion over the Warner Brothers logo at the beginning of Dune. I was like, I don't even know how they recorded that to make it sound that way. I mean, it's never.
I don't either. These sound geeks. I don't know, mate. Like, I don't know. My hat goes off to them because I have no idea how they do that stuff as well. But
Well,
I sat in a session. I did sit in a session, which I was very grateful for, and just listened to the way they watched the reels and the way they looked at particular sounds. And I was like, this is cool. Like, the way they do this is cool.
yeah, I mean, I and the trailer. I mean, there's one thing I wanted to ask you about in the trailer that I thought was interesting. When you see Fade Routha, he's fighting in the arena. It's like black and white, and I don't know if you can answer that about why is it black and white. But I thought that is that the light on the planet, or because that I thought was, can you say why?
Listen, let me go back a step. Remember, I did a Star Wars film, okay? And the way that this, from a security standpoint, the way that the studio treated the secrets of the movie,
Right.
I feel like I've been indoctrinated into the world of just shut your mouth, Greg. Just shut your mouth.
Okay.
I don't know. Who knows what's been said?
Right.
The best way I can do is feign innocence and ignorance and go, I don't know.
All right.
I do know, and I do want to talk about it at some point. I don't know if now is the right.
Yeah. No. I don't want, and I don't want to. Well, okay. Then let me just.
Yes, there is a reason that it's that it's not just an aesthetic choice. There is a rationale. Whether or not the rationale is obvious in the movie, or whether it's something that we talk about during the release of the film, I don't know.
I just thought it was interesting because including it in the trailer, I'm like, that's interesting, And by the way, Austin Butler, boy, does he look great! I can't wait to see what he does. I mean, what a bold. The casting of the movie is, I can't wait. I mean,
I remember being on set one day, and I think it was the scene during the war. It's a war room set. It's in this trailer. It's the fight between Fade and Paul.
Right.
And I remember standing on set one day. We prepped that. We did a workshop with the actors one Saturday, and everybody was there in their normal clothes. But I remember we shot that scene. It took a while. It took a number of days. And after a number of days, when you're shooting a scene, it starts to become a bit like working at an assembly line. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean like the way, because I love the way that the film industry works, and that we're onto a new scene every day or two, or 3 scenes a day, or constantly there's like boom, boom, boom. And this particular scene's long, so it took 3 or 4 days. And I was a bit like going, oh man, okay, we've shot the same scene for the 3 or 4 days. I was getting a touch bored a little bit, not because the scene wasn't good, because the scene was amazing. But I'd figured out I'd solved all the lighting problems, and it was just really just a case of coverage. And I stood there going, wow, this cast I don't think I'll ever stand on a set with this level of cast. Like, I looked around and saw, I mean, again, you know who's in the movie, and the quality. And every single close-up that we did for that scene, I was watching intently, and I was like, the whole scene could play on this close-up. It could play on Christopher Walken's close-up. It could on Florence Pugh's close-up, on Rebecca Ferguson's close-up.
Yeah.
On Javier Bardem's close-up, on Zendaya's close-up, on Josh Brolin's close-up. Like, it could have played on any of their close-ups, and I would have walked away from the theater happy, because they're all such incredible actors, and yeah, it was a great scene to shoot, but yeah, exactly. It was a great casting. I mean, Denis he knows his stuff, right? So,
well, he's also, I mean, again, the whole idea of verisimilitude, part of that comes along with the casting as well. And I was a little like, I love Christopher Walken, but making him the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, I was like, at first I'm like, is that gonna work? Because he's still Christopher Walken. But when you see him in the trailer, you're like, oh, okay. Because that was the one time I was like, because you think of Christopher Walken's one of those. I go back, the first time I ever saw him, I think was Deer Hunter when I was a kid. My mom took me to see the Deer Hunter. She's like, let's go see this movie, and I'm like, it was the most traumatizing movie. I think my mom was like apologetic. She's like, we didn't leave. But I'm like, thanks for that, Mom. Thanks for taking me to see the Deer Hunter. But that was the first time Christopher Walken
Did she
registered.
drive you straight to a therapy session?
I know. It's like, no, she didn't. Listen, I wanted to talk about Creator, and I wanted to talk about just from I mean, again, knocked out by talk about the use of real world locations combined with visual effects technology. And I know it's supposed to be set on Earth, but I'm fascinated by the process of shooting that film. And I wanted to kind of wrap my head around the fact that we all know how visual effects are combined with plates, but with this film, were you sort of unfettered by the former constraints of effects technology, where everything had to have tracking markers and you had to set up green screen? Could you just go shoot whatever you wanted because the effects technology has increased to the point where they can insert anything into whatever live action plate you give them? How did that work? Because the film looks different than any other visual effects movie, and there was so many visual effects in the film. But it's still, because you had that, it looked like you could shoot whatever you wanted.
Yeah.
How did that work?
That's good. That's good. I'm glad that it looked like that.
Oh my God.
That was the intention. But if you recall correctly, Gareth had done a film called Monsters.
Yes. And yes.
And because he's got a background in VFX.
Yeah.
So he wanted to go and make a film. And so what does someone do when they want to go and make a film? He gets a camera, he figures out how to shoot it. He hires a couple of actors that want to come along for the ride, and he goes and makes a movie. And like, which is the most basic thing. Everyone goes, yeah, of course, that's how you make a film. But we all know that's not how you make a film.
Right.
You need this person and that person and that person. You've got it's a myriad of people that you need to be able to go and make that film. But Gareth was so, let's use the word determined, because that's probably the most gracious way. Like, you could use other words like pig-headed or stubborn, but he was determined to make a film like that. And he made a movie, and it was a great film. It was a really good, ballsy film that he did the VFX on himself, and he figured out how to do it. And he knew what the parameters were. So he'd shot himself, which means that if the VFX didn't work, it was all on him. Right.
And by the way, it's a terrific film.
It's a terrific film. And, like, I remember when I got the call for Rogue One, I wasn't sure if I wanted to shoot a Star Wars film, given that I was a big fan of Star Wars. But I 100% categorically wanted to meet Gareth Edwards, to at least shake his hand and tell him how amazing Monsters was. And so, when I met him for Rogue, he kind of expressed to me that was his dream project, is to shoot something like Monsters. And, we both realized that Star Wars probably would not be a bit like that. It would be a bit more formulated, in the sense that the systems of shooting had to be a little more like traditional filmmaking. But we wanted to sort of create that feel within the box of Star Wars, which we did. We had a few locations that we went to that we were like that. Like, we went to the Maldives and we shot like that. We went to Jordan and we shot like that. We went to Iceland, and we didn't quite shoot like that, but we shot similarly like that, as small as possible. So we, when we finished Rogue, like, we just kept talking about what the dream job is, or the dream project is. And we talked about how do we shoot it, and we realized that we needed to get small cameras. We needed to be not confined by, Gareth's a philosopher when it comes to filmmaking. His argument was, well, we could stand there for half an hour and talk about what this shot could be if we do it in post. Or I could shoot it, and it would take 2 minutes to shoot it, and then it might not even make the edit. So I haven't even wasted 28 minutes of that talking time. Like, in the edit, that's when we talk about it. So let's talk about it later.
Wow.
About what's required. And then if the VFX says, no, we can't, look, there's big flyaway hair here, and right behind it, you want to put something that we can't cut the hair out, well, then I'll choose a different shot, or I'll work around it.
Sure.
Let's put it here and not behind the hair. Like, so Gareth he's very understanding like that. And then to have a great partnership with ILM, who, we know how good ILM is. Like we did Rogue
Of
together,
course.
and I did The Mandalorian with them, and and I know how good ILM are. But what was exceptional about them on the creator was that they were flexible, and they were flexible enough with Gareth to give him the rope that he needed to be able to make the film that he wanted, the way that he wanted. And that even went down to camera choice. Like, traditional post house may want the highest resolution camera we could possibly get, 8K, and the biggest bit depth for color, and et cetera, et cetera. Yet we chose the Sony FX3, which
Right.
is no slouch when it comes to resolution or bit depth, but potentially maybe isn't the most professional camera for
Yeah.
filmmaking, because it's a prosumer camera.
Sure.
And so they went along with that, and they agreed to that. We did the tests, we showed them the footage, and they were happy to do that. And I think that's where each of those little decisions, those little choices, add up to something good. Because if you choose to say, oh, well, listen, let's just change the camera out for something a bit larger, so then the whole rig gets bigger and the way of shooting gets harder.
Yeah.
If you do take 5 minutes to discuss a shot and put tracking markers on things, well, then the next time you take 10 minutes, and the next time it's like suddenly your whole day is taken up by, you lose a day of talking about what if. So it was very much led, like it was very much director led. And Gareth, again, he's very determined, and he won't stop shooting. Like if he, like, and he knows, again, he's the one that's responsible ultimately for the way this film looks.
Right.
So he knows that if he wants something behind someone's frizzy hair because there's a wind machine, and well, he's replacing the hair. He's going to be cutting out that head.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you know what I mean? So he knows that, and he's making a choice based on that.
But but for you as a cinematographer, and you want the image to be perfect, when you're running and gunning like that, did it bother you that you couldn't make it as perfect as you wanted to, or you just embraced the idea that we're here, let's do it, let's get the shot, we got that 2 minutes, we don't have to talk about it, I don't have to sit and futz with the lighting, let's just go? Did that make it easier for you, or did you ever be like, hey, wait a minute, can we just get a little fill in here, or what?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with you that I wanted to make everything perfect.
All right then. Okay.
I think that's a misunderstanding. I think again, the word perfect is a very broad term, because what is perfect? And
yeah, I mean, I shouldn't have said perfect. I said it in terms of the way like you wanted it, as opposed to what was there.
So invariably with that film, the way that we wanted it to be was to be found and to be discovered and unmanipulated. Not dissimilar to the Batman in that sense. Like Batman, the intention was for it not to look manipulated, like not to look lit.
Right.
But obviously we know that you go into a nightclub with Batman to get into a fight, you are lighting it. Like that's all light, that's all us, that's everything. So, in the creator, it was a little bit more lo-fi, where we would try and choose locations that we didn't have to light. But of course we did often. But it was trying to create that kind of that feel. And it was the mantra for every single department. Like, so in that few minutes that you discussed, that, where instead of talking about it, you go, well, actually, the director's talking to the actor right now. Like, they're talking about the scene. Let's take that 34 seconds that takes to turn that down, increase that, turn that up, increase the other. Like, we would come up with ways. So my co-DP there, Oren Sofa, did the most of the shoot, well, all the shooting in Thailand, because I wasn't able to get there because I was prepping on Dune. But we developed this kind of mantra of like, futz with it, but don't let anybody know you're futzing with it. Like, don't ever stop the shoot. Don't ever tell Gareth you need 5 minutes to light. Like, not that Gareth would be happy to do it. Of course, if you said to him, you came to him hand in hand and said, dude, I really need a few minutes to do something, he would, of course, buy into that. But you wouldn't stop mid-take. You wouldn't go in when he'd cut and tweak stuff. Like, that was the that you do not do that. No one would come in and do that unless it was an emergency. And so that was part of the way the film feels, is that it feels, captured and
It's
hopefully honest and real, hopefully.
100%. I mean, and again, seeing that on a huge screen, you really, again, it has a look that no other genre film looks like. Again, that verisimilitude, that quality of real, and I think that it absolutely works beautifully. I mean, it's a stunning looking. It was jaw dropping. There were things I'm like, I've never seen anything like that before.
Well, thank you. Listen, from my perspective, I think it's one of the best looking films that I've been involved with. And because I just think there's something really raw about it, and there's something, again, as I go through life, I'm kind of quite passionate about creating reality. Like not shooting documentaries, because that's one thing, but creating drama that has this element of truth, as you pointed out earlier. And the closer I get to that, the better. And the more inspired I get by looking at texture and excuse me. Like, for example, the other night I just went to a gallery showing at Bennett Miller has done a photo series, and the texture in his photographs, they're AI generated, but the texture that he's being able to creates depth. And I'm really, really into this texture thing that filmmaking has kind of lost. We've lost texture in images. Like,
yeah,
and people try and put it back with the set design and the costume design. But I feel like as the image makers, image gatherers, we've lost that ability to create texture and depth. So I'm quite passionate about that right now.
Well, there was one of the things I wanted to sort of wrap this up with that you've talked about before, but Dune, the look of Dune had an interesting, you did some really interesting things with the film and digital capture. Yeah. And I wonder if you could just sort of, and I want to know, did you do the same thing with Dune 2? But could you talk about that process? Because I was fascinated. Again, now we're trying to recreate texture using digital technology. Let's add some film grain, or we can do anything now. But you guys did something really interesting with Dune in terms of the look of the film in post. And I'm wondering if you could talk about using, I thought it was what you did was great. And if you could kind of explain what you did for the post process of giving Dune that look.
So going back a few steps about the process, like, for people who are watching this that don't know much about the technicals, back in the day, we only shot on film. That was what professional movies did, because it was the highest resolution. It was the most stable. You could guarantee that if your light meter said T8 and you exposed it T8, that you would get back an image that represented what you thought it would represent. Mm-hmm. So film, up to a certain point in history, was the most stable, most accurate, the best kind of recording method for something professional that people put money into. As digital came in and took over film, that became more stable, because it became like, you see what you get on the set, and that's what you end up with in the edit. It's what you end up with on screen. So suddenly the digital became higher res enough, and the workflows became stable enough that became more, I probably get a lot of hate here from film lovers, but it became a little more accurate, or a little bit more kind of reliable, better or not, I'm not saying, I'm just saying, like, technically it was probably more reliable than film. And so there was a changeover there where, and now you've got this band of film people and a band of digital people, and aesthetically, and that comes from directors through to DPs, through to studio heads. Some studio heads will not shoot film if their life depended on them. Some directors don't shoot digital because they love film, and we know who those people are, and they have every right to have an opinion.
Sure.
What hadn't existed up to that point, and I felt this, and we highlighted this on Dune, sorry, my Australian accent is
No, I like the way you say it. It's great.
Is that we tested film thinking we're going to shoot film, because that was like, okay, that's in our brain, that's what we're going to do. And we tested film, and we also tested digital, just as an aside, because the studio asked us to test both. And we watched the film out, and we went, it's a little bit, as Denis used the words, it's a little bit nostalgic. You felt like we were looking at something that was built or shot a while ago, and it wasn't contemporary, and
Right.
It wasn't current. And then we shot the digital stuff and looked at it and went, it's too digital. I mean, I can't think of a better word. It was too clinical. It was too clear. It was just not right. And so I'd been toying with a technique for a few years prior to that, where I'd shot on digital, I'd filmed it to film, like done a film out, scanned the film back in, and then graded the film. So I was grading off film, but it became an analog test. And we did a little test just offhand, just to test it, and it was like, that's the look we're after. And it changed. It wasn't just grain. Like, the scientists can go, well, it's just grain that you're looking at, but it's the halation, it's the way the highlights work, it's the way the film weaves a little bit, but it's not enough to make it a mistake. Like it creates an organicness that again, if you're a scientist, you could probably go, yeah, we could create that on with ones and zeros. But I don't know. There's something about the analog, which is where you have filmmakers that dearly love shooting on film, because it creates something that's unpredictable. There's a level of unpredictability when it comes to shooting on film. Like, you don't know exactly what the grain's going to do when you underexpose half stop, because maybe the bath's a bit hotter today, or a bit, like there's a whole series of things.
Yeah.
And by adding this film element back into it, it really helped create something that was a bit more fulsome. And so from there, I mean, I did a test for Matt for the Batman, where we did that, and we also then went to a print, not just a neg. And so, we ended up doing the film as a print, which again made it feel a bit more like a 70s film.
Yes.
But we were able to shoot it with current technology, with the best cameras we could get our hands on, and with the best lenses that we could use for that purpose. And then we could degrade it that way, and we end up with something that had this kind of overall grittiness to it, if that makes sense. And I don't know, I'm on a bit of a bent like that right now. I'm just, because there are so many other options. As filmmakers, we have options to go out to different film stocks. We have, we went out to 35 mil. You could go out to 65 mil. You could go out to 16 mil. You could go out to 22.4 mil, if that's what your look was after.
Yeah.
You can push and pull the film. You can skip bleach the film. Like what it does is it adds a series of tools to our quiver that we had lost by going digital. Because, like when you go digital, suddenly you have to choose a LUT and a camera, and there's only 3 cameras potential. It's not like 20 like there was with film stock.
Right.
So it allows us to choose the recording method that we want. And again, I've had this discussion with some DPs or some people, not just DPs, but also some money people who are like, well, it's cheaper just to apply a filter to it. It's like, well, yeah, it doesn't look the same. It doesn't. It just doesn't. And I'll die on that hill if I need to.
Well, no, I mean, people, that's what do you need that for? But you do need that. I mean, it's the money people. I understand where they're coming from, because it's expensive, but the look of the film is the most. I mean, that's what you have to have a look. I remember when Michael Mann was making Collateral, and he talked about they were using, I think, the Vipers at the time, and he talked about wanting to see into the night. That these cameras, when you pointed a camera down a city street, it didn't fall off into darkness like with film. Like you could see the lights. If you're on a 2-mile road, you could see the lights all the way down. And I was really curious, like, what was that going to look like? And going to see that movie, you could tell, because of the kind of the blacks they were inky, but it had this look that you'd never seen in a movie before. Totally. And then when he went on and did Miami Vice, that film has this. No other movie looks like his Miami Vice. It sharpened up. I mean, there's a shot where one plane is underneath another plane, and you're in the clouds, and it was like, this is striking, and he was using the quality of the image to accentuate the verisimilitude and the feel of it for the audience. Like you were dropped in that urban environment, and it worked. It changed the feel of the whole movie. And I think that's what you've done. I mean, all you have to do is, I think the Batman, Dune, I would assume Dune 2, and The Creator are three different movies that you've done that absolutely have very different looks and feels to them, but the quality of being real exists in each one of them in different ways, but yet accentuates what you're trying to do, what the director was trying to do, what everybody was trying to do, and more than any other cinematographer working today, you've sort of nailed that thing. Whatever I don't know, it's Fraser-esque. Is that what you call it? Like the Fraser feel. I'm going to bring this to, I don't know what that is, but it's certainly something I certainly love and appreciate. So,
well, I appreciate you saying that. The problem is with that is that suddenly then a director's looking for something that's not Fraser-esque, and I don't get a call. And that's what I'm like, well, I've got to be careful, because I never want to, I don't want anybody to say to me that I can't shoot something because I physically can't, because I don't have the right eye. I know it exists, by the way, and I'm not innocent or guileless enough to believe that I could do anything, because there are certain films that I've seen that I'm like, I couldn't have done that. Like, I don't believe I could have, but I don't want to believe that. I want to believe that I could do anything, and I want to believe that I can shoot anything the way the director wants to.
I think, but all three of those movies, they look very different. I think that to me, the Fraser-esque feel would be a philosophical one, in that you can shoot in any environment. You can but you create a reality that I think is a very difficult thing to achieve. I mean, I'd love to see you go back and do like a $5 million indie movie, some grungy, maybe the life story of Cold Chisel, the great little Jimmy Barnes, and go back to Australia. I don't know if anyone's going to do a Cold Chisel biopic, but hey, but something like that.
Maybe I'm sure there's an excess film, out there or something that's bound to be made, Michael Hutchins film or something.
Yeah, but I mean, it would be, that quality is something that you're extraordinary, and your work is extraordinary, and I can't wait to see what you've done with Dune 2, which we're getting in just a couple months, and I counting down the days. And I'll tell you, look, man, I'm sure somebody's going to be playing Dune in IMAX and then come see Dune 2. I can imagine people they're gonna be planning for those Dune weekends, and I think people will be watching both movies back to back in the theater in March in IMAX.
I hope so. I dearly hope so, because I mean, listen, I've experienced this film in IMAX, and it's mind blowing. And listen, normally I'm a little more guarded about films that I work on, because I tend to, that's not my job necessarily to promote films. I love the fact that my job's not necessarily to sit here and sit out on the stage and promote movies. I can concentrate on making them. But I loved this film. I love the sound design of this film. I love, cinemagraphically, I'm really proud of it. Directorially, Denis is a master, as we know. But it's very evident in this film that it's extraordinary. So yeah, I'm keen to get everyone's feedback.
Well, as a fan of the books, I've been reading the books since I was a kid. I just want to see this shit go down, and it does. I can't wait. Well, Greig, is there the last thing we always ask in these interviews, is there any advice you can give to the young people, the people that might want a career in cinematography, and obviously in this day and age of all kinds of digital tools, you have a photographic background. What advice can you give now that everybody's taking pictures these days and putting video up on the internet?
I don't want to purport to be able to kind of put myself in the brain of a 16-year-old, for example, or an 18-year-old who thinks they want to be. I mean, I would try and figure out what a cinematographer does, because I guarantee you those maybe 16 and 18-year-olds don't even know what a cinematographer does.
Right.
And it's not for everybody either. It's a little bit of it's a task where we get paid to kind of stand in the shadows ourselves and not talk about what we do. And that personally suits me. Like, it personally suits me not being, as I said, that the front man of the band, so to speak, where suddenly I'm responsible for doing all the press and I'm responsible for bigging up the film. Like, I love remaining the kind of the basis to the film of the film business, where you are integral to the entire film. You're integral to the way the film looks and feels, but you're not necessarily standing out there at the front. And like I think it's about developing an aesthetic choice, like, because that's what filmmaking is all about, what you choose not to do as much as anything. And because we have many choices, we have every lens under the sun available to us.
Right.
In this day and age, it's not just a budget thing, it's like a choice thing. And so then we have to choose, we have to basically whittle down what this looks like into a small little group. And then you make the choices based on that group. So my advice, I don't know, I think just start shooting and being super critical, and start watching films super critically. And I say this in a respectful way as well. Like, somebody should be watching those films and work out what it is they don't want to make. Like, I do that all the time, is I watch other films that as reference and work out what element of that film is not what we want to do here.
Right.
And I don't do it disrespectfully either for those filmmakers. I do it in that was that film, this is this film. So I'm not doing that, but I'm going to take that and do this and do that. Like, it's a series of, references, really. So, yeah.
Well, listen, I want to thank you. This has been I know it's been kind of a free-form, rambling conversation, but I've learned so much, and I've had such a great time speaking with you. And I really want to thank you for your time. This was a great interview, and I sort of contained my geeky impulses, but I'm such a fan of your work, and it was such an honor to speak with you here on the Designing Hollywood podcast.
You're super kind, mate. Thank you very much. It's been really fun. It's always fun. It's always fun having a good chat.
And thanks very much to our sponsor for this episode of the Designing Hollywood show, the Costume Rentals Corporation. The variety of costumes at Costumes Rentals Corporation is expansive. CRC is recognized worldwide as the premier supplier of military and police costumes and uniform rentals. Costumes Rentals Corporation takes pride in its commitment to each customer, helping to produce the type of exceptional look needed for a successful production. A special thank you to founder and executive producer Martika Ibarra, co-founder, costume designer, the legendary Marilyn Vance, and of course, John Campea from The John Campea Show. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tune in to the audio version wherever you listen to podcasts. I am, of course, your host, Robert Meyer Burnett, and you can find me on Instagram at rmburnett, or find me on Twitter at BurnettRM, or on YouTube at PostGeekSingularity. Thanks very much. Like, subscribe, and give us your comments. What would you like to see on the channel? Right down below. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of Designing Hollywood.